Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We published a program recently with Beatrice Chestnut. She's an Enneagram expert. We developed a program with Beatrice called the Enneagram Roadmap that we've been, hosting here at Personality Hacker, and we've had a lot of people get that program, had great feedback around it. One of the things that Beatrice brought to us in our understanding about the Enneagram is her idea and understanding and some of the nuances in the Enneagram system around subtypes. Now, there's a lot of different language that a lot of different people use. One of the things about Enneagram is it's a little bit more freeform than something, say, like Myers-Briggs, where some of the terms used by different teachers and different people that talk about the Enneagram talk about a lot of different things. And so I just want to be clear, but when I say subtypes, oftentimes when people are using this term subtypes in the Enneagram community, they can be referencing what other people might call instinctual variants, but we call them subtypes. And the Beatrice school of thought, and what we've adopted here at Personality Hacker, is that my Enneagram type, for example, I'm type 6, blended with my instinctual drive, creates my Enneagram subtype. So again, a little bit of confusion in the language, but that's what we're talking about. So if there's 9 positions on the Enneagram and 3 instinctual drives on each of those positions, if you multiply that, that gives us a possibility of 27 different subtypes. So what is an instinctual drive? What am I talking about when I say instinctual drive? There are 3 instinctual drives. There's a self-preservation instinctual drive, there's a social instinctual drive, and there's a sexual, or what sometimes is called a one-to-one instinctual drive. One of those blended with your Enneagram type gives you what we are coming to now call, based on Beatrice's work, your Enneagram subtype. So just to give you a frame of what we're talking about. But today we want to talk about those 3 instinctual drives, the self-preservation, the social, and the sexual, or one-to-one. And we want to talk about those a little bit away from the Enneagram system itself, almost as you as a person, you probably favor one of those, and how that will show up in relationships in your life. So we're going to not talk about the Enneagram subtype specifically. We're not going to talk about the Enneagram specifically. We're going to talk about those instinctual drives specifically, how you're wired with those, and then how your mate or your lover is wired with those, and how that can either cause harmony, discord, conflict in relationship. What does that look like inside relationship? That's what we want to unpack today.
So the 3 instinctual drives of self-preservation, sexual or one-to-one, and social all have a little bit of a different, basically like a different element of relationship that they tend to focus on. Self-preservation, people are more about the relationship to themselves. Sexual is about a relationship that's one-to-one or with one other person. And then social is your relationship to the group. And you'll have one that you lead with. So there's, of those 3, it's basically your dominant. A combination of your dominant and your Enneagram type that makes that subtype, like Joel was talking about. But you're also going to have one that you can think of as like an auxiliary. So of those 3, you're going to have one that's primary for you, one that's auxiliary, and then you're going to have one that could be called an inferior for you. So where it falls in, almost think of that as a stack as well. Where your preferences fall will dictate to some extent the things you pay attention to, your values, the things that will cause fear, the elements that are your value structure and system. They can, to some extent, be associated with your preference stack. And what's been super interesting to us is, Joel, is you're primarily a social instinct. And then sexual or one-to-one becomes your auxiliary. And then sort of at the bottom of that is your self-preservation. Whereas I'm a sexual instinct first, and then following that is self-preservation. And at the bottom is social. So there are different needs that you have, Joel, than I have. Because social is at the top of the stack for you and social is at the bottom of the stack for me. And I also have some weird self-preservation stuff that comes up for me that you don't even think about because that's at the bottom of the stack for you. But what's been really interesting is navigating through my sexual being my dominant and it being the auxiliary for you and recognizing just how that shows up in our relationship. So for me, I realized that my relationship with you, Joel, it takes precedence over almost everything. I would say the only thing that has equal value is our children. And even in some ways, those are their own one-to-one relationships, right? My relationships to, say, Piper, I've created my own one-to-one relationship with her. Now, one of the reasons why sexual and one-to-one are used interchangeably is that it's indicating your relationship with another person, and it shows up probably emerged or evolved over time based on sexual relationships, because that's part of our survival structure. And all three of these are different ways to survive. Self-preservation is a very direct survival tactic. You're thinking about yourself and how you're moving through the world, and you're focused on making sure that you have physical or body safety. Sexual or one-to-one is another strategy for preserving our safety, because if we are bonded to another person, they're going to be looking out for us. And so focusing on keeping that relationship strong is your strategy for making sure you're going to be okay, because pairs are generally stronger than a single individual. And then when you look at the social, there's safety in numbers. And so part of the survival strategy for people who are social is to immerse themselves in a group and then have a lot of people who have their backs.
Yeah, I think about this in terms, I'm not saying this is a correlation. I just kind of think of this, when I'm sitting around just thinking about stuff and different models and maps, I match these in my mind to almost the triune brain theory. You have the lizard brain that's, very focused on the base needs, the biological functions, food, sleep, sex, these kind of things. You have your mammalian brain, kind of, again, the triune brain is a theory. It's not an actual scientific basis. It's just an idea of maybe how the brain is functioning. The mammalian brain, which is all about the connection to other humans. It's all about bonding. It's about social things. And then you have the cerebral brain, the neocortex, the high-minded ideas, some spiritual elements, things that you think in the abstract and you're connected. I'd almost match these up in that way. Like the self-preservation instinct is very lizard brain focused. The mammalian brain basically is tied to the one-to-one or sexual component. And then the social brain, or the social, is tied to the cerebral, the neocortex. It's all about the abstract relationship that's out there with society or people and groups in large. So this is just one way to kind of slice and dice this in just a different fashion for me as I look at this. I think it's an interesting thing to think in terms of, and I think you're right. I think it is all based in our survival strategies. We look at that and we go, okay, what's the best way I can get the needs met in my life and survive through this world? My ego can continue on. And when I look out, it's very tied to the social component. It's about people liking me. It's about having resource. It's about being able to generate resource. It's about having opportunity. It's about connecting to lots and lots of people. The more people I'm connected to, that means I've got a safety net. If I got ostracized from the tribe or from the group, that means I can't make resource for myself and my family. So I'm very concerned about my survival based on almost a cerebral essence of relationship. These people aren't even necessarily close to me. It's just making sure I've got a good relationship with everybody in my world. Whereas you, Antonia, have a survival strategy where it is definitely about those one-to-one bonds. It's about the bond between two people makes it very important for you. And that's how you're saying, that's how I'm going to move through the world. I don't really care what the group thinks in some ways. I mean, you care, but in some ways, as long as the people that are close to you and fused to you or bonded with you, as long as that relationship's good, you don't have a lot of worry about what the group thinks if they quote unquote kick you out of the tribe, because that's not really where you're focused on for strategy.
And of course, all of the strategy elements to this are deeply subterranean. I'm not consciously aware of that. When I create a one-to-one bond with somebody, I'm not thinking, oh good, I get to survive another day. But that's sort of the point of origin. That's where all of these emerge, is ultimately from these strategies to get along in life and to extend your life cycle as long as humanly possible. And so then these strategies become to some extent hardwired inside of us. And that's just the thing, that's the point of origin. But a bunch of behaviors and ways of seeing reality and things that are interesting to us end up emerging from those points of origin as well. And I've really noticed this in our relationship. Like you mentioned, I have different behavioral focal points than you do. Yours in my relationship is very important to me. And it's the thing that I would say that I pour into and foster the most. And you're the person who actually recommended we do a podcast, which I was hesitant to do because that broadcasts, a concept to a bigger audience. And what you've taught me to do is to see that the person, or experience that the person listening to us, is one person. And so that's made it more intimate for me, because then I can talk to you, the listener, and you and I can have a one-to-one relationship, which makes it a little easier than, sort of envisioning this vast array of, unknown unknown quantity of people listening and having to manage this idea of all these like faces and what their impression would be. And that's not really how I think. I think more in terms of bonding and one-to-one. So that's made it a lot easier is to go, oh, I'm talking to one person. And that's cool. And I'm talking to you and I'm talking to this one other person. And we can have like this little intimate relationship. And I feel like I'm way more powerful one-to-one than I am in front of groups, where I think that you're actually the opposite. I think you're more powerful when you're in a group environment and you're leading a full group than I am. I feel like I have the edge on the one-to-one piece. I'm more powerful in an intimate setting, and I think that you're more powerful in a group setting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel alive. I feel empowered. I feel like I'm in a leadership frame when there's a lot of people. And it's almost there's almost a spirituality to it. That sounds weird, but there's almost this sense of there's a part of me that gets unlocked when I'm standing in front of a group of people helping lead a group towards something, whether it's a new way of thinking or it's just emceeing an audience to an event of some sort or for an event of some sort. It is almost a spiritual, I feel a connection with the people that are there in a group setting. And it's almost like this little temporary community, temporary culture that's created that I just love helping to foster, create, and be a part of. And you're right. I think the one-to-one piece I have a harder time with because, it's not about connecting with a broad audience. It's about talking with one person, connecting deeply with them. And I think probably because my one-to-one is secondary, I don't have as much, like I don't know the rules I can break. I don't know what's the different nuances there. I don't know what's, not what's appropriate or inappropriate. I do understand what, like in general sense of that, but I think I just shy away from it because it's a world that's a little bit more fuzzy than the social world.
I think it also demands more of of an intimacy when you're going to create a one-to-one, even if it's a temporary interaction.
Yeah.
I think you have to be pretty open to intimacy that doesn't allow you to have control. When you're bonding and fusing with another person, the goal is, I've started calling it soul spelunking. The goal is to get as deep with the other person into each other's souls as you can for whatever amount of time is allotted to you. And you can't go very deep down the rabbit's hole if you are hanging out with a person, maybe say for an evening at a party, and you just happen to connect and you're sitting on the couch and talking and it's been 4 hours and it's been super amazing. And you've really shared yourself with them and they've shared themselves with you. And there's a deep sense of intimacy there, even though you can only get so far when you're first meeting somebody. But then you get to see yourself from their perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy being a one-to-one or a sexual subtype, is that I get to see myself through other people's eyes and visit different parts of who I am that I might not be able to access all on my own. They're helping me access those different chambers and areas of who I am. But I think for a social subtype, that's not as rewarding because you're actually learning about who you are in the midst of the group. There's a different form of learning. But I guess the point of all this is that once we learn these about each other, I think some elements, there were some ahas that were had. One of them being that, and I had this major aha about a month ago, that I realized that our relationship is my life's work. And that is also deeply spiritual to me. Like you mentioned, there's a sense of spirituality when you're with a group. And when I really fuse with another person, I've started calling them fuse relationships. When I really bond with another human being, I don't just bond, I like fuse to them. And it's a forever situation for me, really. I would have to like, I'd have to figure out how to unfuse. I've had to do that a couple of times. It's very painful, unfusing from somebody. But I've started calling them fuse relationships. And they're very deeply spiritual to me as well. And that kind of made me think, I wonder if people who are self-preservation, this is one of the reasons why there's not just, say, martial arts, but there's spiritual martial arts. I bet there's like a sense of spirituality that comes along with learning how to protect your body and protect yourself as you move through the world.
Yeah, there's probably different levels of this. Like you said, I think there's probably a physical level of getting certain needs met, in the survival strategy. And then, like you said, I think each one of these probably also has that spiritual tone or spiritual element. There's probably a lot of maybe there's emotional and psychological elements in here too that each one helps us meet. And as we go up the scale, they're meeting different needs. And yeah, I resonate with that a lot. And I'm seeing people show up in those. I see parts of it that are physical. I see parts of it that are spiritual. I see parts of it that are psychological and emotional.
I think it's very helpful to be able to gauge what things are going to feel really rewarding for you and really spiritual, and the parts of you that you're going to want to nourish. And I think it's important to not only diagnose that in yourself, but also diagnose it in your mate, Because if it's different, they're going to be looking for different things to create that sense of spirituality or nourishment, and you might not get it because it's not yours. I've realized that if we're going to be doing this thing that I'm calling soul spelunking, right, going as far and as deep as we can get as two human beings fusing together and exploring the deep inner terrain, I realize that I'm going to have to be the person who leads that. You're not reluctant to go there, which is awesome, because I think if I was with somebody who was reluctant to do this, that might be something I'd have to strongly take into consideration as to whether or not this was the spouse that I should be traveling through my life with. Because this is such an important piece of who I am. This is such an important element of who I am. And I didn't really get that until I understood that I was asexual, that's my instinctive of choice. And then when that became clear to me, so I gave myself a lot of permission. All of a sudden I was like, yeah, you're right. A romantic relationship, a relationship where I truly fuse with another human being is the single most rewarding experience I can have in life. So I need to recognize that if for any reason you're not as like running as far deep down that rabbit hole as you can with me, like if you're not like, that's not your charge too. And I'm like, come on, let's just go as deep as we can. It's not because you don't want to give that to me, but it's because that's not your first point of entry like it is for me. So if we're going to be doing that, I need to recognize that I'll be leading us there.
Yeah.
And to not feel any sense of resentment or like you're not interested or that's not interesting to you. I just recognize that that's going to be a more of a thing for me. So like if I want that, then I'm going to have to guide and lead, and it's going to be okay.
I think that leadership piece is key. And I think that's really, as you say that, totally willing to go there with you, totally willing to go down the road with you. But it's not inherent in me. I don't know that world it's like your cognitive function stack and your Myers-Briggs type, right? Like I don't know my auxiliary or co-pilot as well as I know my primary and dominant and my driver function. Just like this is almost like the sexual or the one-to-one piece is a little bit fuzzier for me. I want to go really deep with you. I want to get really intimate and do that soul spelunking. But I'm wired for my intimacy, my spirituality, my even getting the basic needs met to take the lead in the social realm. And so a lot of the way I lead in this relationship is trying to get us into more of a social frame where we're quote unquote broadcasting out. Our relationship dynamic is here, we're bonded, and then I want to turn attention and say, okay, let's share what's happening here with the things we're learning with others. So let's do a podcast. I'm driving really hard this year coming up to do a lot of meetups. I'm jonesing like crazy to get out there among people. I get some of my best ideas. I feel untouchable. I feel amazing when I'm out among people and we're connecting with a larger group of people and audience at these different meetups we've done in the past and we're going to continue doing in the future. And I think I'll take the lead in that. And you probably are totally willing to go to meetups. You're totally willing, obviously, we're 4 years into the podcast. You're totally willing to meet me on the social end. It's just you're not probably going to take the lead in that. But once someone else takes the lead, you're right there with me. And what's great about that is, so let's just back up for a second. When you look at these, if you're in a relationship, you're dating somebody, maybe you're in a really serious relationship, you've moved in, or maybe you're even married or committed in a very intense way because each of you have different needs you're trying to attend. And so we could talk a lot about the conflict that might come up from that. So that'd be something to look at. Like, where are we mismatched here? But what's also awesome is that once you rest into yourself and as you start to develop and grow and you take the lead in whatever your wiring is, it actually gives you a whole new world of possibility you didn't have when you weren't in that relationship. So what's interesting for me, for example, is if I was by myself or if I was in a shallower relationship, maybe with somebody that wasn't wired the way you are, Antonia, I might show up and I might not have the experience in my life. Let's say I'm married or in a relationship with somebody that's self-preservation. I would have a lot of self-preservation experience, but I wouldn't have this experience with you, which is this soul spelunking, this really deep, connected one-to-one experience. And I get to experience not just the thing I'm wired for in life, which is the social piece, but now I get to experience a whole nother element of life because I'm together with you in a relationship. And it just brings so much richness and nuance to it. And I think the same thing works for you. You probably would definitely experience the one-to-one aspect. That's what you'd be craving. And if you were in a relationship with somebody that wasn't wired with the social piece, you may not be accessing all the social elements of life that you could access. So it's really, if you have struggle, if this is causing conflict in your relationship, if you can start reframing this as, wow, look at how much more of life I get to experience because I'm with this person. Yeah, there's going to be some conflict. Yeah, we got to work through a couple things. We see things a little differently. But now I've just doubled the experiences I have in life just because my partner is wired differently. How amazing and awesome is that?
Yeah, and I noticed that my self-preservation it's higher on my stack than it is for you. And so different things like, I was very insistent that Piper take martial arts. That was very important to me.
Yeah.
And so we've got her in martial arts, and she's recently earned her yellow belt, and it's ridiculously cute. But one of the reasons why is because I want to make sure that she can protect herself physically. And so my self-preservation is giving her, I'm trying to gift that with her because it's important to me. And that wasn't like a big thing for you, but you've definitely supported me by taking her to martial arts on evenings that I can't. So I think that we both live richer lives. I agree with you because we're able to acknowledge the other person's need is a little different than ours, but we can reach out and go, okay, as long as you're willing to take the lead on this thing, then I'm totally there to support you. And to show a way that you've enriched my life, let's pretend I'm right, that our relationship is my life's work. Nobody would be able to, I would not be able to share my life's work with anybody else if I didn't have somebody who was a social subtype like you encouraging me to broadcast that, because social is at the bottom. Like, it's definitely my blind spot. And I don't really think in terms of broadcasting. I don't think in terms of sharing it with a group. I think in terms of those intimate relationships. And so you saying, hey, we should start a podcast and, talk about the things that are interesting to us and to some extent share the results of our intimacy and our relationship with the world. Now you've made it so that my life's work can have an audience. And that's been amazing. That's been incredible. So you've enriched my life so much as well. And I think that's the point, to spin this around, like you said, to zoom out and not just focus on our relationship, but to encourage you, the audience member, to discover what yours is, and then also that of your spouse. And to see it in terms of, like you mentioned, Joel, not just, okay, if mine is different than my spouse's, then I'm going to have to take the lead in this piece, and I can't resent them from not taking the lead. But also to recognize how when they show up with a different focal point, I'm getting benefit from that. They're bringing things to me that I would not have gone out and sought myself. But I think there's the big piece of this is having that communication, having the language for what's going on for you, which is why, of course, I love models, because models give us language for what's going on. But just being able to have a conversation around it and say, I'm never going to take the lead in the social piece. If you're waiting for me to be the person who's the engine driving the meetups, Joel, that's probably not going to happen. Like, you're going to have to be the engine there. And I can't wait for you to be the engine in the soul spelunking. I can't wait for you to show up and be like, okay, I'm going to grab your hand, and now we're going to walk into the deepest chasms of who we are and explore our inner space with each other. Like, if I'm waiting for you to do that just to show that you're willing to do it or that you're into it, I'm going to be waiting a long time, because that's just not your natural tendency. And so giving each other some space to have a different tendency and to bring different things to the relationship, and then being able to talk about it and recognize what's happening, and then learn ways in which these things are compatible. Like, I think if we hadn't had that conversation around it being our relationship being my life's work, and you providing an audience for that, if we hadn't had that conversation, I don't think I would have been able to be as grateful to you as I am by bringing that piece to me. I have an elevated sense of gratitude that you're wired differently than I am, because I'm getting the rewards from that. And when you, the listener, talks to the person in your life, your relationship, and you guys kind of self-diagnose where you're at with these, and then talk about ways in which you might have to let go of expectations of your spouse, but then also, have gratitude for what they bring to it. I think that's a really rewarding conversation, as opposed to, oh, I'm different here and you're different here, and, let's call the whole thing off, or how will we ever meet in the middle?
So again, this idea of not expecting your partner or the person that you're in love with or your romantic interest to take the lead in whatever your instinct is. Maybe both of you are one-to-one/sexual subtypes, or both of you are self-preservation, or both of you are social. And here you probably do have some degree of depth to that. If both parties are the sexual subtype, and you both want to go soul spelunking, like Antonia talks about, that can probably be pretty deep and pretty intimate. And yet, I bet you that you're going to have a lot of blind spots because you're doubling up on what your interests are, what you're wired to go down. So the social piece or the self-preservation piece may not be, this like star-crossed lovers that are both maybe sexual subtypes. I almost have this like imagination of them just like walking off a cliff, lovingly staring each other's eyes to the degree where they just like fall to their death because there's no self-preservation represented there. I mean, that's a metaphor. That's like an image in my mind, but that actually could show up in a various of ways in your life based on how you're wired and your partner's wired. And I think the other piece of this too is when you are in the dating scene, when you are maybe young or maybe you're older and you're re-entering the dating scene or you're still there and you're going on dates with people, you're trying to find the romantic partner you want to be with. This is just an interesting little model. Sometimes it's interesting. I've found that sometimes I can identify people instinctual drive even better than their personality type in a rapid way. Because it's almost like it really betrays how we are wired for that survival piece. And often that also carries with us our ego. For example, I'm much more interested as an example of getting credit for things. Like I want to be known for the things I do in the world. Well, why would that be the case? Why is my ego so much more interested in having my name on the credits, quote unquote? Well, because I'm social. That's how I know, that's how I'm gauging whether or not I'm doing well, is what is the social feedback? What's the group saying? Am I still included in the group? Am I getting credit for it? Whereas for you, Antonia, it's more about the impact you're making in the world. The credit's not as important for you.
Well, I would say attached to my sexual subtype, it's being attractive.
Yeah.
Like I don't care if I get credit, but I want to know that I'm attracting people.
Yeah.
Because that's part of my strategy. Like let's say you get hit by a bus, something inside of me is going to immediately start looking for another one-to-one bond because that's my survival strategy. I mean, I might. My own personal development might encourage me to have some space for a time, but that's not my instinct. My instinct is going to tell me to go create another one-to-one bond. And so being attractive is always something that's in the back of my head because I'm going to need to have that card up my sleeve. Maybe I'll need that card. And so the credit's never been an issue for me. I don't care if I get credit, but do people like me? Am I attractive?
Yeah. No, the one thing we haven't really talked a lot about is the self-preservation. It's kind of my last. And what's interesting in my life is that I think because it's the last one in my life, it's exhibited in some weird ways for me. Like there have been times in my life in very ebb and flow where I'm more concerned about germs, for example, like survival. When I get on an airplane, I'm like very hypervigilant all of a sudden about checking where the exits are. Even though I don't think this is a strength of mine, I think the reason why it shows up in weird ways, like a little bit obsessive around like getting through airport security lines and getting on an airplane and some of the things around like germs or getting sick is because it's something that I don't really understand the rules of at all. And so I maybe overemphasize this in my life. And so it comes out in different weird ways. So sometimes you get a false read. At times I thought maybe I am self-preservation because I tend to like look for things that are safety issues around me. But I think I do it almost like in a childlike fashion in a lot of ways. And it's almost like you're, liken it again to the inferior 3-year-old cognitive function in your cognitive function stack in the Myers-Briggs system. The third in your stack, this is my opinion. Again, I haven't really thought this out. So I'm literally just talking about this live right here. It feels to me like it's almost like an inferior process that sometimes can come out in childlike ways where it looks like it's overrepresented and it's grossly overdone in some weird fashion. And so I don't really understand this, but you have this as your secondary position, and how you're, like you said, it came up for you in like preparing Piper, our 5-year-old, with karate. What are some other ways we could look at this showing up in relationships where it could either cause the tension point or it could be a leadership frame like we're talking about for the 2 types that we're wired to?
I imagine that people who prefer their self-preservation are probably pretty tied into safety. They're making sure, hey, is everybody buckled up? Like, it's probably very protective. It's protective of the family safety, protective of their bodily safety, making sure that they have a resource. I would imagine this probably shows up in like hardworking, men and women who want to make sure their family has enough resource to be able to, to keep them safe and well fed. And it probably feels like a very protective energy. It is, I'm sure it's more protective than anything else. With me, I've noticed that because my social is my very last one. I've noticed for me, it's one of those things I'm either thinking about or I'm not thinking about at all. And when I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure how worried I should be about it. Kind of like you mentioned, you're mostly not thinking about it, but then all of a sudden when you do, you like hyper focus on hand washing a lot or looking at the exits for the airplane. Whereas I think I mean I don't hyper vigilantly look around for the exits in the airplane because I have that like well in mind. I've actually literally read the manual of what to do in an accident, or not an accident, but like an emergency landing. I've read that thing through so many times that I just remember what it is at this point. So I don't really worry about it because I've got it, committed to memory. And so, I mean, it's not like it's a lot to remember, but it's one of those things that I always pay attention. I always find myself paying attention to the instructions that the flight attendants give no matter what. And it's like I can't not pay attention to it because this is important. This is our safety. So self-preservation, I think, more goes towards protecting the family and a safety orientation. And I think of all of this, I think a piece of it is when you're talking to the person that you're in a relationship with or kind of vetting somebody for relationships, you kind of got to give them some space for focusing on something that is going to be out of your attention. For me, one of the ways that this has shown up is that as a sexual subtype or one-to-one, I form these fused relationships with more than just my spouse. I form fused, bonded relationships with people who are important to me. So like I have a very strong fuse bond with like my dad. And one of the challenges I'm going through right now is that we discovered that my dad has dementia, and it's unlikely that he's going to live for more than a couple years. And he was one of my earliest fuse partners that I can remember as my dad. But we're estranged right now, and he won't really allow a relationship to happen at this point. So maybe that'll change as he gets closer to the end. I don't know, and I'm totally open for that. But right now, what I'm going through is one of my fuse partners is dying, and I can't be there for them. They're not letting me. And so I'm going through a lot of grieving because of one of my bonded one-to-one relationships. My fuse bond partner is not allowing me to be there for them at the end. And I'm realizing that's a big piece of being a one-to-one type, is that we're there for each other at the end. Isn't that kind of the point of the strategy? That we're there to support them and we're there to comfort them. And that's why we create that strategy for survival, is that it makes life just a little easier that we can do that for each other. And I'm not allowed to do that for him. So I've done a lot of personal grieving around that, and you've had to create some space. I mean, it could look just like, hey, I'm losing my dad and that's hard. But I've put it down to that very specific thing is a big piece of the grieving. And you've been very understanding. Even though you might not experience it in the same way, you've been very understanding and given me a lot of space around that. And you have a need for socializing that I can't replicate. Like you would socialize 10 times more often than I would. It's actually, now that I think about it, they might be one of the reasons why some extroverts think they're introverts and some introverts think they're extroverts. An introvert that is a social might think of themselves as an extrovert because I have a greater need to be a part of a group. Whereas I'm an extrovert, but I'm a one-to-one. So to me, I'm trying to escape the group to get intimate with you as often as possible. Like, hey, you and me talk. So this might be one of the reasons why, the introvert-extrovert delineation is like kind of thrown off a little bit. But that's a little bit of a tangent. Getting back to the point, I've had to create some space for you to be able to go socialize when I'm not necessarily in the mood for it. And for you to get a bigger context and, have relationships with more people than just me. I would keep you all to myself if I could. It would just be you and me against the world. And also it's not how you're wired. So I have to make sure that I don't keep you and lock you into that dynamic because that's my druthers, but that's not yours. So I get to have the intimacy with you, but I also have to let go a little bit and allow you to have like a broader expanse with those relationships. And that's okay. Like I've figured that out. But I think if I didn't have this language around it, it would probably be a lot more difficult to orchestrate.
I would agree with that. And I think that, so as you're listening, as you're thinking through this, I think the first thing you can do is start to think in terms of what do you think, independent of your Enneagram type, what do you think your instinctual drive is? What's your dominant and what's maybe your secondary one, and what's your your inferior, your third position, your tertiary. This is just something I think you could just bullet point out, get a sense of, and just that alone, not even trying to triangulate against the person you're in a relationship with, just having that for yourself alone, I think could just give you a lot of insight into yourself.
Yeah, I'm sure we're winding down, but just one thing I wanted to add there, because I'm sexual and you're social, we've not been talking a lot about self-preservation.
Yeah.
But I could imagine a self-preservation person maybe even to their spouse, if their spouse is not self-preservation or self-preservation is at the bottom of their stack. I could imagine the self-preservation person feeling oppressive sometimes because they want to ensure that you're safe. And maybe part of how they show they love you is that they are working hard, or they don't seem to be as around because they're making sure that the creature comforts are represented. Or maybe they just are hypervigilant about everything and maybe come in with like a mama bear or papa bear energy. And you're like, I don't need you to save me all the time. But giving them that space to have some hesitancy about taking big risks, and maybe giving them some space to go, okay, I get that this is why it's really important to you. And as long as I get my need represented, I can give you space for yours as well, which is maybe working really hard, long hours or something to that effect. So I know that we haven't talked a lot about self-preservation because neither of you or I have that as a dominant, but that also is an important piece, is giving them space for whatever the needs that they're nurturing inside of themselves.
I remember reading a story about an entrepreneur, a very famous entrepreneur, a very household name entrepreneur, that in their relationship, their spouse was very nervous because they had done an entrepreneurial activity that had lost a ton of money and it put their family in jeopardy. And when they were ready to go for their second or third business, I can't remember which one, their spouse said, listen, I can't go through this again. It's too tumultuous for me. I get too threatened by the idea of us not having enough. And so what this person did is they took several $1,000s in cash and put it into a piggy bank. Like they literally went to the bank and got several $1,000s out, I think in $100. I don't remember how it happened, but they basically got thousands of dollars into this piggy bank and handed it to their spouse and said, here, you always have this. All you have to do is break it open and you'll have this cash available to you. And this is yours to keep as I go and try to build this business. Whether it fails or crashes, you're going to have this as a safety valve to just know that you're okay. And that comes up to me. That story reminds me that person probably was a self-preservation person that has a lower maybe threshold for risk, and this person lovingly gave them a container to where they could feel safe and rested that, okay, as you're out there experimenting with business, because you can't guarantee business is going to work if you're an entrepreneur, you have a safety valve to know it's going to be okay. Just rest into that. And that was a way that a spouse accounted for that in their life. So that's just a story that came to mind as you were talking about that. So I think making a list of what you think yours are, and then the person you're in love with, the person you're in a relationship with, just making a little quick bullet point, maybe have a conversation with, listen to this podcast together, have some conversation around which do you have, how do they show up for you in the physical world and the emotional world, the psychological world and the spiritual world. Where are the crossovers? Do you share each other's secondary position basically based on these wirings? Where's the conflict? And then where are the opportunities for amazingness? Could you change some of the conflict, reframe it to go, we could see this in a context of conflict, but wow, look at this. Not just conflict, but we have the potential to have a bigger experience in the world based on the fact we're wired differently. How amazing is that as people? And I think that really could help in relationships, like as a tool for us to frame relationships. That's really an interesting tool in my mind because it gives us an access point to see the possibilities rather than just the conflicts yet again.
Yeah, I have an idea just popped in my head, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
We're talking about the spiritual element of this. I was thinking about like martial arts and the spiritual component that comes in with some fighting, being like that's how the self-preservation spiritual element shows up. I think congregations of people all worshiping together is how the social element of spirituality probably pops up to some extent. Or one expression of it. And I was thinking, what about sexual or or one-to-one? How does that spirituality look? And what pops up was Tantra.
Yeah.
I bet Tantra is born of finding spirituality in the sexual act. So there's different components of spirit. You don't have to necessarily go that track. I was just thinking of examples of how we see the spirituality popping up in different ways. Anyway, it's just something totally ancillary that popped in my head, and I wanted to say it before we wrapped it up.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did. So what about you? What do you feel is your instinctual drive? What do you think is your second and third position? How's this showing up for you in your life? We would love to hear from you. Your voice needs to be represented in this conversation. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment or ask a question directly below this show. You can also join our community. This is my social subtype coming out, right? Come join our community of people over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you'd like to leave a little one-to-one love, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps us out a lot.
Yeah. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.